You think you know someone after 25 years together. You think you've heard all the stories, figured out all their quirks, and settled into a quiet sort of comfort where no surprises are left. Trust me, I thought the same. Emma and I had built a life, a history, a future. Or at least, that's what I'd believed. Here's the kicker, you never know how deep betrayal can cut until it's there, staring you in the face, with the world you thought you'd built unraveling thread by thread. Sit down, this is what they don't tell you about marriage. We met at a friend's dinner party back in the early 90s. Emma was a nurse, quiet, observant, had this gentleness that somehow kept me on edge, like she was always watching with a little too much understanding. I was fresh off my training as a commercial airline pilot, new to the responsibility, still addicted to the thrill of takeoff and landing in unfamiliar places. When I first saw her, I thought she looked like she'd walked out of a novel or one of those black and white movies. Soft curls, calm smile, and eyes that could quiet a room without a word. I was smitten, of course, just like any guy my age would be, but for her, I was willing to try this new thing, stability. And for the first time, I felt I'd met someone who could make all the chaos of life feel calm. Emma offered that in a way no one else could, or so I thought. We were a bit old-fashioned. By some miracle, both of us had the notion to save ourselves for marriage. Maybe it was her idea, maybe I was just swept along, romanticized by the thought of building something sacred together. In any case, we decided we'd wait, a decision that, for me, underscored the uniqueness of what we had. We were choosing each other, choosing to honor our bond in a way that felt strong, even invincible. I didn't have an easy job to accommodate it all. Piloting is a lonely line of work, and with me traveling constantly, we spent days, sometimes weeks, apart. But Emma had her own quiet strength, and she understood, at least on the surface. When we finally tied the knot, I was over the moon, convinced that we were defying the odds by marrying not just out of attraction or convenience but out of a bond that felt, as cheesy as it sounds, unbreakable. The wedding was beautiful, or at least I remember it that way. Best man was Chris, my best friend since high school and the guy you'd have wanted as your best man. He was loud fun, with just the right dose of charm to make even the driest party tolerable. When I first started dating Emma, he was the one advising me on the classic, how to win her over nonsense. He even suggested the idea for a surprise picnic proposal. He stood next to me when I said my vows, clapping me on the back and tossing jokes about how brave I was to be marrying someone as perfect as her. Chris, standing next to me with his arms slung around my shoulders, laughed his way through his best man speech, talking about the good old days, loyalty, love, and how grateful he was that I'd found someone who got me. I felt was gratitude for having both Emma and Chris beside me, two people I could count on unconditionally. The first few years were everything I'd hoped for and more. We faced every test a young marriage could, tight budgets, long hours, miscarriages, and the endless march of days that seemed to blur together. But every hard day, every low, felt like a sacrifice we were both making for something that mattered. There was intimacy in those struggles, a sense of shared hardship that no one else could touch. With every landing I made, with every time I walked through the door after weeks away, I told myself I was building something. For her. For us. She was the glue holding it together. And yet here I am now, alone with a sick taste of irony filling my mouth, wondering how blind I could have been. You'd think that if you invest decades of your life into someone, enduring the worst of each other and surviving it all, there'd be a point where you've earned their loyalty. I was naive, but back then, I would have bet everything I had on Emma. After our wedding, I threw myself into work even harder. I was convinced that with enough hours in the sky, I'd eventually make captain and give us the life I thought we deserved. The early years of marriage were what I'd consider the good ones. We were young, stupidly in love, and believed we could take on anything. There was something exhilarating about building a life together from scratch. We scraped by, clipping coupons and counting coins for bills, but we found joy in the simplest things: cheap dinners at home, late-night movie marathons, and watching our kids take their first steps. In those early years, we lived in a small apartment on the edge of town. I was flying long-haul shifts, coming home with sleep-deprived eyes and a stiff back. Emma was the one constant in a life full of turbulence. I'd come back after a week's worth of flights, and there she'd be, making a cup of tea or finishing a book in her usual spot on the worn-down couch. She'd always look up, smile that smile, and everything about my job, the airports, the delays, the exhaustion, would disappear. It sounds pathetic, I know, but there's a certain bliss in thinking someone is waiting just for you. The years weren't easy though. We had our struggles, ones that can make or break a couple. We lost 2 pregnancies, both times after months of dreaming about the future. The kind of loss that hits you in waves, with no warning. Emma went quiet after each loss, retreating into herself in a way I couldn't quite reach. I tried to be there for her, to talk about it, but every attempt felt like poking an open wound. Eventually, she seemed to find her way back, or at least I thought she did. She buried herself in taking care of our firstborn, and later, our second. And I busied myself with work, trying to provide, hoping I could shield her from the blows life kept throwing our way. Through it all, Chris was right there, practically part of the family. If I wasn't home, Chris was over for dinner or picking up the kids from school when Emma needed a break. He had a way of lightening the mood, cracking jokes that back then seemed harmless enough. I can't count how many times I came back from a trip and found him on our couch, feet up on the coffee table, laughing like he'd lived there all along. He was so woven into our lives that I didn't think twice about it. I told myself that we were lucky to have him, that he was the kind of friend you'd be a fool not to keep around. The truth is, I'd always been suspicious by nature, but Emma had disarmed me over the years. I trusted her implicitly, and I felt no reason to let doubt creep in. That's one thing I'd learned as a pilot. Doubts can be dangerous, especially when you're operating with lives on the line. You push them aside and focus on what matters. I brought that same mentality home with me, and for years, it worked. Besides, every time I'd come back, I'd see her waiting for me, just as calm and steady as she'd been on our wedding day, and every suspicion dissolved. So when things quieted down, when the kids were in school, and I'd finally managed to claw my way into the rank of captain, I thought we'd made it. I told myself that every mile I'd logged, every night I'd spent alone in some cold hotel room, had all been for us. That the foundation we'd built was stronger than anything that could shake it. The funny thing about foundations, though, is that they can crack in silence, slipping one layer at a time until the structure above them collapses without warning. You don't hear it until it's too late. I had no idea that the life we'd built, the memories I held onto so tightly, were hiding fractures I couldn't see. When you're young, you think love will be enough. You assume that shared dreams and promises will carry you through every sleepless night, every paycheck stretched to its limits, every disappointment. What they don't tell you is that marriage is a marathon, and even the strongest runners sometimes trip. The truth is, life becomes a grind, and love is only as strong as the people holding on to it. As the years went by, we settled into the rhythms of married life. There were routines, little habits that grew around us like ivy, so slowly I didn't notice how they changed things. The spark of our early days dimmed to a gentle warmth, a comforting routine. And for a long time, I thought that was enough. But being a pilot meant I was gone a lot, even as the kids got older. Every time I left, Emma was there at the door, a weary smile on her face, ready to hold down the fort until I returned. She'd take care of everything, school pickups, groceries, bills. It was a thankless role, and I knew she was carrying a lot. I admired her for it, sure, but I'd be lying if I said I didn't start taking it for granted. I had faith in her commitment, in our bond. I never questioned it. I never questioned her. And Chris, he was always there to help. My long absences meant that he'd step in when needed. He'd bring by groceries or fix things around the house that needed it, and Emma seemed grateful for his company. I convinced myself it was normal, that he was being a good friend. I trusted him, and I trusted her. I missed a lot of things, I'll admit. When I came home, Emma's smile was a little less bright, her eyes a little more distant. But I figured it was just life wearing us down. And when I was there, we had those rare, quiet moments of comfort, a glass of wine on the porch after the kids were in bed, or a weekend outing if I was lucky enough to have a few days off. Those moments felt like enough proof that we were solid. We didn't have to talk about the tough stuff. We'd been through enough together that I assumed we could weather anything. It never occurred to me that love, once so simple and unbreakable, could be chipped away so quietly by the daily grind and the gaps left in my absence. But life kept rolling on, and every trip, every mile in the sky, felt like I was working towards something worth it. I trusted that Emma and I were solid, two people tied by years of shared battles and promises. It was a rainy afternoon, the kind that traps you indoors and makes you restless. I was sorting through the attic, half-heartedly going through boxes, thinking it was time to clear out some of the junk we'd accumulated over the years. I wasn't looking for anything in particular, just passing the time until the storm passed. But then I opened an old box labeled Memories. Inside were photos, ticket stubs from places we'd been, and tucked at the bottom, a small leather-bound diary. I knew Emma kept journals back in the day. She'd write about our trips, our first few years together, her thoughts on motherhood. Harmless stuff. But something about this journal felt different, worn, hidden under everything else, like it hadn't been meant to see the light of day. Curiosity won. I sat down and opened it, expecting to find musings about our early days, maybe even some nostalgic memories of when life had been simpler. The first few pages were innocent enough. Emma wrote about the excitement of our engagement, her nerves about the wedding, how she felt like she'd found something solid in me. I almost smiled, flipping through the pages, caught up in her words, remembering the better days. But then I reached a page that made my stomach drop. The date was only a few months before our wedding. She wrote about a night with Chris. My mind refused to process what I was reading. It was surreal, like finding a glitch in reality. The words blurred in front of me, but the meaning was clear. She'd felt lonely, confused, unsure about our future while I was away. And Chris, my best friend, had been there to comfort her. At first, she wrote that it was just an innocent evening where she confided in him. But the next entry told a different story, one where that innocent evening had crossed boundaries I thought were sacred. It didn't end there. She wrote about more than one night, about meeting Chris in secret while I was off flying. It started with her feeling lost and needing someone, but her entries quickly turned to the thrill, the escape. She mentioned guilt, but only in passing, like a minor inconvenience she'd managed to push aside. The words twisted a knife in my gut as I realized that while I was working to build our life, she was out sharing parts of herself with the one person I'd trusted implicitly. And then came the part that truly broke me, details of their physical connection. She described feelings and moments that were supposed to be ours, things I thought only we had shared. It was like reading about a stranger's life, but that stranger was my wife, and the person she was with was my best friend. I sat there, numb, flipping through page after page, each one feeling like another punch to the gut. The more I read, the more the illusion of our life together shattered, like watching a tapestry unravel in slow motion. The woman I thought I knew was someone else entirely, hiding behind the face of the person I loved. It was all there, laid out in her words, like a confession she'd hidden away, hoping I'd never find it. The realization washed over me. Our life, our marriage, was built on a lie, one carefully concealed beneath years of routine, of quiet smiles and late-night conversations. All of it tainted. I closed the diary, my hands shaking. This wasn't a single mistake, a moment of weakness she'd regret forever. This was a betrayal woven into the fabric of our relationship, one that had been covered up for years, hidden behind the mask of a loving wife and loyal friend. In that moment, everything I thought I'd known crumbled, leaving nothing but anger, disbelief, and a gnawing sense of loss. The shock of finding that diary felt like getting hit with a ton of bricks. Suddenly, all those years of friendship, laughter, and loyalty felt like they'd been stolen from me. I tried to remember every moment I'd spent with Chris and Emma in the same room. The Christmas dinners, the lazy weekend barbecues, the birthdays we'd celebrated together, always with Chris right there beside us, like part of the family. Every time I'd seen them chatting or laughing or exchanging a glance, I'd chalked it up to nothing more than friendly familiarity. But now, every one of those memories seemed loaded with a hidden meaning I'd been blind to see. He'd been there at our wedding, laughing beside me, toasting to our future. And now I saw it as the cruelest irony, a man standing by my side, pledging loyalty as my best man, while holding onto a secret that would later gut me. I remembered our family vacations, where Chris would join us for the drive up to the cabin, joking around with the kids, treating them like his own. It felt twisted now, knowing that he'd looked my children in the eyes, knowing what he was doing to their father. He had been in my home, shared meals with us, celebrated holidays, all while hiding a lie so vile I could barely wrap my head around it. And Emma. My wife, my partner through the hardest years, the one who had smiled through late nights, offered reassurance when my own insecurities got the best of me. She'd built this life with me, but all the while, she'd been keeping part of herself locked away, in a place I'd never even suspected existed. The memories grew darker, sharper, as I thought about how many times I'd called Chris during those long flights, talking about Emma, about my dreams for our future. He'd listened, he'd joked, he'd offered advice. And all that time, he'd been holding on to a secret that would tear my life apart. The betrayal was so calculated, so entrenched in every part of my life, it left me wondering how either of them had looked me in the eyes for so many years. What I couldn't understand was how they'd managed to keep it hidden for so long. How Emma had shared a bed with me, raised children with me, played the role of the loyal wife with a mask so convincing, it hadn't slipped even once. And how Chris, of all people, had managed to face me day after day, holding on to this brutal secret as if it were the most natural thing in the world. It felt like an infection that had slowly poisoned everything I held dear, hidden beneath a veneer of trust and friendship. I couldn't look at the family photos on the wall or think about the memories we'd made without feeling them tainted by their lies. In that attic, I sat alone, surrounded by boxes filled with our memories, now nothing more than artifacts of a life built on lies. I didn't confront Emma right away. I wanted to, believe me, but something held me back. Maybe it was the shock that kept my voice from working, or maybe I just needed time to let the anger fully simmer, to make sure I didn't lose my mind and do something reckless. So I waited, let it boil, let it settle, until finally I was ready. One evening, I came with diary in hand, and set it down on the kitchen table. Emma was in the next room, folding laundry, the picture of a dutiful wife keeping our home in order. I called her name, my voice low, barely recognizable. She turned, and the look on her face when she saw the diary was enough to confirm everything without a single word spoken. Her face drained of color, and for a moment, I almost saw the Emma I'd known, the kind, reliable woman who'd stayed strong for me when things got rough. But as the silence thickened, any shred of sympathy vanished. The weight of the betrayal came crashing back, and all I could see was a stranger standing in front of me. "I think you have some things to explain," I said, my voice cold and distant, even to my own ears. Emma looked away, her hands twisting nervously. She opened her mouth, but for a few agonizing seconds, nothing came out. When she finally spoke, it was in a barely audible voice, as if saying it out loud would somehow make it worse. "Michael, I didn't want you to find out like this." Her words felt like a slap in the face. Didn't want me to find out like this? Like what? She'd planned to reveal it on our anniversary with a ribbon and a card. "Just tell me why, Emma. Why him? Why for so long?" She swallowed hard, and her face crumpled as she tried to gather her thoughts. "I was lonely, Michael. You were gone all the time, and I didn't know how to tell you. Chris was there. He listened, he understood." "Don't give me that," I snapped. "Lonely? So what, you thought sleeping with my best friend would fix that?" Her eyes filled with tears, and she mumbled something about vulnerability and mistakes. But every word sounded like an excuse, each one more hollow than the last. Nothing she said could justify the years of deception, the sheer depth of the lies. She'd not only betrayed me but had shattered every belief I had about love, friendship, and loyalty. The conversation quickly spiraled into her pleading, her excuses tumbling out like a broken dam, how she felt neglected, how she thought I'd moved on from her emotionally. But to me it all sounded the same, betrayal dressed up in the flimsy clothes of self-pity. And when she brought up Chris, trying to explain that he'd been there for her, I couldn't hold back any longer. The fury that had been building finally burst out, tearing through my resolve like a storm. "I don't want to hear about how he helped you, Emma. He was my friend. My best friend. You two didn't just betray me. You took everything I trusted and threw it out like it was nothing." She broke down then, crumpling onto the chair, sobbing into her hands. But there was no comfort I could offer, no reassurance left in me to give. The years we'd shared, the memories, the life we'd built, it all seemed meaningless now, tainted by the web of lies she'd spun with the one person I'd trusted most. As I watched her there, pleading for forgiveness, trying to explain, I realized that nothing she could say would change what had happened. I was done being the man who trusted blindly, who sacrificed everything for people who couldn't even respect him enough to be honest. Save your apologies, Emma, I said, my voice cold and final. I've heard enough. And with that, I turned and walked out, leaving her with her guilt, her lies, and the life she'd chosen. The damage was done, and there was no fixing what had been broken so completely. I'd always thought of revenge as something dramatic, an act of explosive anger, a moment of sheer chaos. But the reality was different. Revenge, I discovered, is a quiet, methodical thing. And after Emma's confession, I found a new focus. My anger transformed from something explosive into something cold, precise. If they thought they could play me for a fool, then it was only fitting that I show them exactly what that would cost. The first step was simple. I went to a lawyer the next day, wasting no time. I wanted to make sure that every asset, every bit of financial security Emma took for granted, was covered. I emptied our joint accounts, shifting everything into a private one that was out of her reach. The house? I filed the paperwork to transfer it under my name alone, a technicality we'd left unaddressed over the years and one she'd never cared enough to follow up on. Then came the social fallout. Our friends, family, every single person who thought we had the perfect marriage, had the right to know what a lie it had been. At first, I thought about keeping it private, letting it unfold quietly. But something in me snapped when I realized that hiding it would only let them both off easy. No, this needed to be public, as undeniable as the betrayal itself. So, I told people. And as I did, word spread. It was surprising how quickly it caught on, like wildfire, almost. One by one, friends began to cut ties with Emma. Family members who'd adored her were left in shock, and she soon found herself isolated from the world we'd built together. The whispers of infidelity reached every corner of our community, painting her and Chris in the harsh light they'd earned. Chris didn't come out unscathed either. He had his own life, his own family, but that didn't protect him from the wreckage he'd caused. His wife found out, and the fallout hit him with the same force. She packed up and left, taking their kids with her and filing for divorce faster than he could try to explain himself. He tried calling me a few times, his messages filled with half-hearted apologies and empty excuses. I deleted each one without a second thought. Let him live with the same silence I'd been left with. His career took a hit, too. Word got around that he wasn't exactly the loyal friend and husband he pretended to be, and his reputation plummeted. Colleagues started to avoid him, and the respect he'd enjoyed vanished. In a matter of weeks, he went from someone people admired to a man they avoided. As for Emma, the kids took it hard. Seeing their mother become the subject of whispers, sensing the tension that now filled our home, it changed things. They were disappointed, and while I tried to shield them from the full weight of it, there was no way to hide it entirely. Emma attempted to explain, to justify her actions, but they were as hollow to our kids as they had been to me. I knew she felt the shame, the sting of the loneliness she brought upon herself, and I let her sit with it. Then came the day she approached me, eyes red-rimmed, voice thin and broken. She begged for forgiveness, for a chance to make things right. She'd lost friends, respect, and the stability of a marriage she'd taken for granted. But all I felt was a deep, unshakable resolve. Some things, I told her, aren't worth mending. Some betrayals cut too deep, burned too fiercely to ever be forgotten. And that was the end of it. She stood there, alone in the wreckage she'd created, a mere shadow of the woman I'd once loved. And I walked away, finally free of the lies, the betrayal, and the illusion of a life that had never truly been real. Months passed, and life took on a different shape, a quieter, simpler one. Starting fresh wasn't easy, but it felt necessary, like clearing out dead wood to let something new take root. People reached out at first, friends who wanted to check on me, to offer their sympathies. I let most of them fade away. I realized I didn't need reminders of a life built on deception. Instead, I focused on building a new one, piece by piece. The routine of work helped. Flying was the one constant in my life that still felt steady, untouched by the chaos Emma and Chris had unleashed. In the air, there were no memories, no betrayal, just the quiet hum of the engines and the clouds below. Emma tried to reach out a few times, sent messages saying she'd changed, that she was working on herself, hoping I'd give her a second chance. But I couldn't see any path back to the person I once was, the one who'd loved her unconditionally. That man was gone, replaced by someone who now knew the fragility of trust. Her words felt hollow, like echoes of a promise she'd broken beyond repair. Chris, on the other hand, had disappeared from my life completely. Mutual friends told me he'd moved away, left town to start over somewhere far from the ruins he'd made of his life. Part of me thought he might reach out, try to mend the friendship he destroyed, but he never did. And honestly, that was fine by me. Some things deserve to be left behind. My kids took time to adjust. I did my best to be there for them, to offer stability where Emma had left uncertainty. Slowly, they settled into the new reality, understanding that while some things had fallen apart, there were still pieces left to hold on to. They needed me, and if nothing else, the betrayal had sharpened my focus on what mattered most. In the end, the betrayal shaped me, not in the way people like to imagine, with endless bitterness or a vow to never trust again. No, it left me with a clarity that was almost freeing. I'd learned that love is fragile, something you can't simply assume will last. It has to be built every day, with honesty and respect, and once those are gone, there's no going back. I still think about the life Emma and I had, about the years we spent building something I thought was unbreakable. But now I see it for what it was, a hollow shell of what could have been, an illusion crafted by two people too stubborn to confront the cracks forming beneath the surface. As I looked out at the life I'd begun to rebuild, one made of quiet moments and genuine connections, I knew I was stronger for having survived it all. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was stepping into it with eyes wide open. Love isn't just about holding someone's hand, I thought to myself one evening, watching the sun set over the new horizon of my life. It's about making sure they never have a reason to let go. And with that, I moved forward, leaving behind the ruins of what could have been, and finding a hard-won peace in what remained.